to Demystifying Poetry. I'm your host, Tara Stubbs, and for this episode I also have a co-host with me, Rydian Cook, who is also the producer of this podcast. And this idea came about because some of the feedback from the last series suggested that people might want to hear more about the host of the podcast and their interests in poetry. But what I thought might be more interesting to do was to have a kind of discussion about the podcast as a whole and about both mine and Rydian's views about the podcast and the ideas that have come out of it. So I'm just going to introduce my co-host. Rydian Cook is a genderqueer, multi-award-winning filmmaker, a video and filmmaking mentor, a photographer, a skateboarder, an actor and a performance poet. And he describes himself quite correctly as a multi-hyphenate. And as I also mentioned, he's also the excellent producer of this podcast and doing all the hard work behind the scenes.
Hi, Tara. I'm
Hi.
really happy to be chatting on the podcast. This is wonderful.
Good.
So I will introduce you now and give you a little bio. Tara is a Professor of Modern and Contemporary Literature, Fellow of Kellogg College, and member of Oxford English Faculty, British Academy Innovation Fellow 2023 to 2025, and she is the host of this actual podcast.
So I think there's going to be quite a few meta moments in this episode.
For sure.
And it's going to run a bit longer, I think, because we've got quite a lot to chat about. So the first thing we thought we might chat about is about the podcast itself. And what it's been like both behind the scenes and thinking about some of the cross currents between the episodes and what our favourite episodes have been and what has been surprising. So, Rid, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I suppose I would like to talk about it kind of generally, as a whole, the podcast from my perspective. I come to poetry from a performance perspective. And that's the kind of world that I kind of sit in currently. And I don't feel particularly well read or well educated in poetry. So for me, it's just been a really accessible way to learn more about poetry, the poetry world, which just seems to be so vast. So that's been really great for me because I'm dyslexic. You know, for me to, if you gave me a book and said, look, here is a book about, you know, covering a lot about, you know, poetry in the world now, I would not read it. I'm interested in poetry, but I would find it daunting. But actually to be involved in this podcast and hear different people from different perspectives and different directions and different areas and their work with poetry, that for me is a wonderful way to hear about all these different worlds and different perspectives. So I've just really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and we were just talking earlier, weren't we, about the fact that this podcast has made me feel like there's so much more for me to learn. And that's something that's been really challenging for me as someone who has been working on and with poetry for, you know, more time than I'd like to admit, but at least since I started university in 1999, so over 25 years. And particularly for the second series, I've heard about 20 or 30 names that I never knew before.
Yeah.
And that's quite humbling, actually, in a way. And it makes you realise that you've always got more to read and more to think about.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, I think, from what you just said is that what you find daunting and what I find daunting, I think, are really different things. So I would never be able to get up and perform poetry. I just couldn't do it.
No, yeah.
And I wouldn't want to do it. For me, it wouldn't be worth the risk. It wouldn't be worth the nerves.
Sure.
And I'm completely happy to sit in a cafe and read a book of poetry.
Yeah.
And I love books about poetry because I
Yeah.
write them myself.
Yeah.
But for you, it's like the flip, seems.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, you would be quite happy to perform.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can tell that from just the way that you're talking now.
Sure.
That you quite enjoy that sort of spoken word element.
So yeah, it does feel like you're sort of coming to poetry from different directions.
Yeah.
But what's really, you know, you would use the word humbling, is it's similar for me because I'm like, oh well, I I couldn't name 10 poets from history that have been really amazing or whatever. But like you're saying, through this podcast, you've learned, that there's so much more to learn.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm like, oh, okay, well, me too. And that's okay. Like, isn't that lovely? And it's the same for lots of other people. It doesn't, because I don't have a degree. I'm working class. I was born in Cambridge, but I don't consider myself like an academic. So yeah, it's wonderful for just to discuss that we've come from these different directions, but actually we both feel that there's still this big world of poetry to discover.
In sort of very boring educational terms, I'm the opposite of that. I've got my BA and my MA and my PhD and whatnot, but that isn't the same as the world that you inhabit, and it makes me feel as if the kind of curriculum that we have around poetry, particularly in places like Oxford, doesn't reflect any of the contemporary world and the energies of it, and also the different ways of disseminating poetry as well. I know more and more people are looking at things like zines and periodicals, but there's still not much work coming up, at least from the people I know, about performance poetry, about poetry like Nicola was talking about in space. Those kinds of ideas. What happens when you completely disassociate poetry from the page?
Yeah.
There's not very much work being done about that. No. Definitely not in the worlds I know.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating to learn that it is going on elsewhere.
Yeah.
But it's also strange that we seem to know not very much about it, and there doesn't seem to be that much exchange between those spaces.
I have to say that podcast, about concrete poetry, I was kind of, what is concrete poetry? I don't know. As the podcast went on, I learned more and more about it. And I think I sort of made this assumption that it was something that I should know about. If I was more well-read, I would know about this or whatever. But actually, the more I heard about it, the more I was like, oh, okay, this is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And not something that's sort of explored within education or whatever. And
also it's more within an art space than it is within a poetry space.
That's it, yeah.
So you're more likely to learn about it if you're working in the visual arts.
Yeah.
Than in poetry.
Yeah, which is incredible, isn't it?
And I would don't mind admitting that until a few weeks ago when I started reading up on it more, I thought concrete was more of a literal idea.
Yeah.
It was poetry and concrete.
I thought so too. I thought, okay, concrete poetry. So it's poems that are put into concrete.
Yeah.
That's what
and I think it probably was that at some point, but it's much more metaphorical now.
Yeah, for sure. I loved when she spoke about that poem that is literally just one word, wind.
Yeah.
But the letters are in different places, and I was able to visualise that and just be like, oh wow, that sounds like a really good poem. I think I'd really enjoy looking at that on the page.
But I know lots of people who would say that isn't a poem.
Sure. Yeah, and that's the big debate. What is a poem?
Well, it's not that different from a kind of conceptual art space where it's like, is it art?
Yeah.
That's asked a lot, isn't it? But I think the poetry world, it seems to be now to be divided up into all these different groups.
Yeah.
That have completely different definitions of what poetry is.
Totally, yeah.
And it feels like we ought to be able to create a space in which they're all valid.
Yeah.
But I think that is work that hasn't been fully done yet, to be honest.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I get asked a lot, and I sort of mull it quite a lot as well, like, what's the difference between a poem or poetry and spoken word?
Yeah.
And I'd struggle to answer it, because I know what I do. I write stuff, but then when I write stuff, it's mostly with the intention to perform it.
Yeah.
So then you go, okay, well, it's spoken word because I want it to be spoken. But then I do also feel like it's poetry.
But you wouldn't necessarily call it performance poetry, or would you prefer spoken word as the...
Personally, I've said in my bio, I'm a performance poet. I like using that word performance because I love performance, and that's how I came to poetry. So yeah, the spoken word doesn't feel quite right because it's missing out the performance element of it.
And would it be possible, though, to be a spoken word artist who doesn't perform?
I think so. Yeah. And I think it depends on the poet. It depends on the person. So for me personally, I like to call myself a performance poet.
Yeah.
And I like to perform poems. Whereas Dominic, when he was talking, I've noticed this about him. He says, I say this poem.
Yeah, he does.
I love saying that poem. I'd never heard that before. That's really interesting. Because I don't say I said that poem, I say this here, I say that there. I think there's something interesting about that. I say I perform poems.
Yeah.
Because for me, there's an element of performance to it that I find really important.
But I was wondering whether, like, listening to Dominic, a lot of his vocabulary suggested that he's quite unique. And I think it might be from this background as well, being essentially self-taught and finding his way through.
Yeah.
That actually it's quite interesting to hear somebody who doesn't use the same vocabulary around poetry as you do.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it's also quite challenging.
Yeah.
What does it mean to say a poem?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've never heard of that either.
No, yeah,
I've heard of read, or I've heard of speak, or, like you say, perform.
Yeah, and I think there is differences.
Not say.
Yeah, I had this discussion with Dominic on the day that we did the recording. He sort of said that I think if anyone can be picky about the words they use to describe their poetry, it's poets. Because we pick the words or whatever. And we spoke about his work with children, and he said that he likes the word play.
Yes.
And he doesn't so much like the word workshop because it's work and it's a shop that sells stuff. So he prefers to, let's play with some words today. But then in some education settings, not all, but some, they might dislike the word play because this is education. We're not here to play.
And it suggests kind of a lack of constraint that sometimes educational establishments can be a bit frightened by. And wasn't it fascinating as well that having talked to Nicola and Dominic, they both used the word play, but in completely different contexts.
Very true. Very
true. I thought, what an interesting idea running through. Quite a lot of the episodes actually has been play, but from completely different angles. So Brian Bilston talked about play.
Yeah.
Jacqueline Safra talked about play, but they're all doing it in completely different ways.
Yeah, yeah.
And what about the non-poets that we've talked to? Have you learned anything from them?
Yeah, I love the episode where it was talking about the poetry pharmacy and prescribing poems. And I thought that's really amazing work to be doing.
And it's also in the world of play.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you go to the cafe, the coffees are named after poets. They bring you a slip of poetry with your coffee. And some people I know have dismissed Deborah and said this is all too light. There's nothing serious. But for me, if it's getting poetry to people, it doesn't matter how it's done.
No, for sure.
And my son loved it.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Bringing back that feeling of enjoyment that you might have lost with poetry over time.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think, something that's wonderful about the work you're doing is it's about access to poetry. And for me, like I say, I don't go to poetry libraries. I don't pick up poetry books. And part of me is like, why don't I? should do that. I should do it. I'm just not drawn to it. But I would love to go to a cafe and be prescribed a poem, and that sounds really interactive and fun and wonderful. Do you know what I mean? So I think,
and almost like therapy as well. It kind of crosses into that therapeutic space, doesn't it? As well.
And I think that's something that's come across a lot with the podcast. All these crossovers.
Yeah.
I talk about poetry and performance, and with the concrete poetry, it's that visual element as well with the words. And, there's a lot of crossover. And the pharmacy adds a crossover of therapy and poetry and wellness. And how about you? What do you think?
Well, one thing that's come up more and more for me has been the hidden figures behind poetry as well. Be those teachers. We obviously will talk a lot about mentoring, but how, he was talking about how those women were almost like silent mentors for a long time. But then Nicola was also talking about co-production, remember?
Yeah.
When you kind of work, you have to go and work with a graphic designer or with an artist.
Yeah.
Their imprint remains in the poem, but it's not always seen as a co-authorship. And I find that stuff really fascinating because often there's people in history who are a bit like that. So, for example, when W.B. Yeats started writing his more spiritual verse, it turned out much later that he hadn't really said how much his wife was involved in that.
Right.
Yeah. And now there's a whole book written about their collaboration.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful.
And I think that was one of the things that I found as a kind of theme that goes through is that there's all these people in the poetry world who seem to be quite generous as well. And, librarians as well. Nicola was talking about that archivist that found her that stuff that she ended up being then really fascinated by, that Dominic Sylvester Weddard guy. And I thought that's really interesting. And for me, that could almost be a different podcast, which is like, who were the hidden figures who've led you to where you are today.
Yeah, for sure.
And a more common one might be, my English teacher.
Yeah.
Or, somebody who took me seriously at some point. But it's also people like archivists, librarians, other poets.
Yeah.
And I'm sure in your space, it's probably the feedback that you get from the listeners. Because I presume a lot of those
100%.
are also poets.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And friends.
And we actually found out, didn't we, on the other day, that Will's sister is also in the performance world.
Yeah, I literally,
where you are.
The Thursday before we recorded, I was talking with her. I just performed and we were talking about each other's performances. Her poem was about her nephew.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
we connected about that because I have a nephew as well who I wrote poetry. And then, literally
who's
days
also Will's
later,
nephew.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, and then days later we're recording with Will's.
Yeah.
With Will and, connecting over that, which is really, really beautiful, isn't it?
And this idea that there are a lot of people who are working in the poetry world with quite a lot of optimism and hope, which I think in these times, which are often really difficult and really dark, I've found quite moving, actually. We were talking earlier, weren't we, about just the enthusiasm that drips off a lot of the people we've talked to.
Yeah.
And how they still have all this energy,
definitely.
despite being in these worlds for quite a long time. Most of the people I've talked to for this podcast have been working in poetry for at least 20 years, sometimes 30 years.
Yeah, wow.
Even 40 years in some cases. And they don't seem to have lost any of the joy for it or the passion, which is quite moving, I think.
It is.
And they seem to have more and more ideas around it as well. And I also think it's been really good to find out about what an inclusive space it can be as well. So, in the first series we had Liz, who does the poetry walks and does reading with people. And she, as she admitted, is quite a shy person, but was able to still find a space within poetry to able to be herself, but also to be able to communicate with others about her poetry.
Yeah, because anyone, absolutely anyone, can be involved in poetry. I think it doesn't have to be reserved for people who are well read or want to perform it, or they don't feel confident enough to perform, or they don't want to read, or it can be for anyone, because ultimately it's language and it's words, which most of us have access to.
And I think also it's a form that, if you're willing to engage with it, gives a lot back, and if you're
it really does.
confident enough with it, can mean something for you.
Yeah. I think what I like about poetry is that it's brief.
Yeah.
And I know they can vary in length, but they're ultimately quite brief. And it's about that moment you're sitting there reading, or you're sitting there listening to, or you're sitting there watching it, and you're, and just that immediacy about it.
Yeah, and it kind of epitomises that thing about that we all seem to think about a lot now, which is trying to be in the moment, whether it's meditation or mindfulness. But poetry encourages that, I think.
Yeah,
particularly
definitely.
Performance poetry.
Yeah. As again, there's that crossover, isn't there? Because I do yoga.
Yeah.
And I'd never thought of it of linking in with poetry, but then it has. We've spoken about that on the podcast, So.
And when I went to see Brian Bilston perform a couple of years ago, I remember that the experience of that was very intense, but in a really good way. That I remember not thinking about anything else for the whole time he was performing.
Wow.
Because there's something about the power of that. His timing is really good as well. Almost like a stand-up comic. But you were just there, and I remember it really well, and I think it was because I wasn't distracted.
Yeah.
And you have to listen really carefully to get the nuance and to get the jokes. So if you let your mind wander, it won't work.
Yeah, sure.
So I think it's really interesting in that it kind of concentrates the mind as well, but in a nice way, not in a upsetting way or anything like that.
Yeah.
So we might move on to talk about our own worlds and poetry and our own experiences.
Yeah, let's do that.
And I know that you wanted to share a few tidbits about your life in poetry and how you'd got to where you are now.
Yeah, I want to speak about how I kind of found poetry, really. My introduction to it sort of will have been through education. I suppose the big memories of introduction to it are actually hearing it. And actually I was trying to think last night about poems that I remember from school. And I think Half Caste by John Agard. And I'd sort of, I can't quite remember if he visited That would have been amazing if he did, but I can't remember if he actually did or not. But what I'm certain of is that I heard the poem spoken, whether it was a video or it was a tape. I was in school in the early 2000s, so it wouldn't have been YouTube or anything. But I'm certain I heard it because I do remember being sort of struck by the performance of it and also the language of it. So I think what I really liked and connected with was it wasn't like the Queen's English, you know, and to me English was like the proper words, you know, like in a book it's the Queen's English, you know, so that I found exciting. But other than that, I wasn't super interested in reading or poetry or anything like that. And the thing that I started to do that really was, you know, poetry for me and really exciting was not during English class, but actually during physics.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So I would sit, I had 3 friends, all female, who I got along really well with, and I was quite funny and silly and performative. And we would write poems and then perform them to each other.
What, during physics?
During physics, like just before physics and kind of during as well. I think we sort of got there early because I loved it. I just loved being with my friends and performing or whatever. And we called it the Cheese Club. It was just us 4 sitting there. We all sat together, have the Cheese Club, and we would write. And what I would do is, so we had a mathematical physics extra workbook. So in that book, I would write poems and do drawings and stuff. My friend Louise, Becca and Rebecca, they were both called Rebecca, and they were good friends, and we would perform these poems to each other, and it was really, really fun. And what happened one day is we my physics teacher, who I won't name, but frankly, you know, it wasn't very inspiring. I wasn't very excited about physics. One day we had a cover teacher who was my English teacher, who was wonderful, who I will name, called Nikki Madden.
She covered the physics class?
She covered the physics class.
Wow.
One day, and she saw that I was writing poems, and she quite rightly said, like, look, you should not be writing poems in your physics book, but these are really good, and you can actually use these for coursework. And I was like, really? this is not work.
For English coursework?
Yeah, for English coursework, not physics. But, but I was like, that's bizarre, because I was just playing.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about the word play. I was just playing. I was just having fun with my friends. I was like, I can use that for, well, that's incredible. Like, so that was her perspective on it. I thought, oh, okay, that's kind of cool. I might do that. And one day I had to hand that book in. Of course, it did have work in. I did do, you know, my physics work in that workbook, but I had to hand it in for marking. And then I got the book back and it had been marked. And I flipped through to the back of it. I always put the poems and the drawings all in the back. And the pages had been ripped out.
What, with the poems on them?
With the poems. All of the poems had just been ripped out.
Oh my gosh. But that was your intellectual property?
Yeah.
And did you ever get them back?
No. So I said, you know, I raised it with the teacher, you know, and I sort of spoke with Louise, my friend, and I was like, look, they're all gone. And so I was, you know, upset and spoke with the teacher about it. And I said, where are my poems? Like, and she said, oh, they're in the bin. I said, can I have them back? She said, no, they're in the bin. And she said, they're gone. You shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be writing the poems. And which, she's right. I shouldn't have been writing those poems in that book. But she's wrong in the way that, you know, she could have inspired me and sort of said, well, you know, I realise now I'm really into skateboarding. She would be like, well, look, write a poem about skateboarding and the physics of skateboarding.
Yeah,
you know,
she could have turned it into a creative.
That's it. So that happened.
Makes me want to cry, though.
Yeah.
I can imagine. You must have been really...
I was totally gutted.
Yeah.
So I think that definitely sort of heavily impacted me. And I think
it's just so, you know, teachers have a responsibility to students, don't they? To not, I don't know, to not discourage them and to not be so dismissive. I think that can be... It can be really damaging, that kind of attitude. I mean, she could have ripped them out and just given them back to you separately.
Yeah, that's it. Why did she put them in the bin?
That's what normal people would do, I would say.
Yeah. But I don't totally blame her. I realise now that the education system isn't, you know, great.
No, and she didn't know what she was looking at, possibly. Yeah. Oh, Reed, that's a sad... You're right, it's a sad story.
Yeah, so it's sort of... And actually, I didn't use any poetry for my course, so not from memory. I didn't do that. And then I didn't really do much poetry from like that period forward right through to I was like 25-ish, I would say. And by that point I was kind of a filmmaker. I did write a film. That's why I'd had a couple of award-winning films, and I was writing films, and I did write a film about that experience that I actually haven't made. But that's why I really wanted to tell the story on this podcast, because it's a story that I want to be out there. But yeah, that's.
And what does your cheese club think of it?
They were gutted as well. We were just all gutted.
Were they writing poems in their physics books?
I don't know. I think we were kind of all putting it into mine.
Yeah.
So I think some of their poems have probably gone too as well. So it was kind of a group sort of gutting thing, and
And it's really annoying because it's almost like a material, quite literally material demonstration of this annoying thing where STEM, as it's called, and humanities aren't allowed on the same page.
No.
It's actually a very interesting metaphor.
For sure.
But I actually know a couple of people who are physicist poets.
Right.
There's someone called Iggy McGovern who's at Trinity College Dublin. He's a physicist, but I think he looks at space and things like that. And he's done many sonnet sequences around physics. So it's completely possible.
Yeah, it is. Totally.
So do you have a more positive story from other experiences?
I do. I mean, I suppose it's after that point I didn't do much poetry, and then I did have a kind of brief period, I think it was sort of my late 20s, where I was kind of like, oh, yeah, poetry. That's when I wrote that as a film, and then I started writing poetry again. And that was very much kind of like making time for writing films and writing poems. So I had that, and that was good, but I didn't perform anything. And then kind of fast forward to 2021, I just moved to Manchester with a view of really getting into acting work. And then poetry cropped up as a thing of like, I've got a bunch of poems. Even though it's just like a bucket list thing, not like an ambition thing. It's actually my latest poem. It's called Ambition, actually. But I was like, I want to perform one of my poems on stage. I want to do that. And I performed for the first time ever, and I just went and did it. I didn't actually tell anyone else. And I was pretty nervous, but really excited about it too. Because I know about this about myself now. I like being performative. I like people looking at me, seeing me doing a thing, So I was really excited about it. And I went to this event, performed my poem, and honestly, like, it went so well. I was just so amazed. Like, I could just sense the vibe of the audience responding to my poem. And then lots of people talking to me afterwards about, how they connected with it. And then the event organizer was, do you want to headline the next event? Wow. And I was like, wow, that's just came out of, this was my first time ever reading. I just sort of came away from that. Just
the confidence boost.
Yeah, it's absolutely buzzing. I remember I sent a voice note to a friend, Ree, who is someone who, we're both poets, and we've kind of actually inspired each other to write more poetry and perform more poetry. And they've actually read for the first time recently as well. And previously they would never even get close to it. They were so nervous about it, and they're a brilliant poet. So we've actually inspired one another to actually get out there and perform.
And how would you measure what is good or brilliant or similar ideas within the performance world? Is it if it kind of captures the imagination? Is it to do with creating an atmosphere in the room? What would you say?
I would say that there are so many different factors and dependables that can go into a performance.
So it's a bit like the stage, I suppose, like theatre.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
there is this one poem that I performed quite a few times, and each time I performed it, I felt the quality of it was different, even though the words are kind of the same.
No, but that's fascinating, and it is more like theatre then, isn't it? Yeah. Where you learn your lines, but you have no idea how they're going to land.
For sure.
Yeah.
And it's to do with, it might be to do with how I performed it. And I sort of might come away from it and go, maybe I could have performed that better. I could have paused here. I could have had more eye contact or whatever. But also, it's also to do with the room and who just performed before me and the mood that the room's in and all of that sort of stuff. And that's all just really exciting, actually.
And I guess that's also completely random. So it's not like you can choose your set the way that Dominic was talking about the other day.
Yeah, totally.
When you come in and you're like, I'm going to do 12 and I'm going to do it in this order.
Yeah, with the open mics.
Yeah.
There is very little control. The person who puts on the event, they might pick the order of who goes on. And I know Dominic does that for Hinterland Poetry Night, which is where I most often perform. or have recently anyway. But even then, you don't really know what each poet is actually going to perform. So, but that's actually what's kind of exciting about it, is you just don't know. And also, I think I've sort of come away from some of them. So I'll say now, I'm kind of at the point now, I spoke about the first time I did it, but probably now I'm at the point where I've done over 10 times I've been on stage. Sometimes I come away, I was like, oh, that wasn't very good. Yeah, and then there are other times where I've come away, I've gone, wow, that was just, I can't believe, the last time I performed, it was a completely new poem, and there was a lot of laughter, and I didn't really, when I wrote it down, I didn't really intend it as a funny poem, but I liked it, I welcomed it. And there was laughter at the start, and then there was sad silence in the middle, and there were clicks at the end. And I came away from that just being absolutely buzzing, because I was like, wow, I've kind of, my favourite kind of art is the art that kind of gives you the multitude of emotions. A bit of laughter, a bit of sadness, a bit of crying,
But that's also a sort of collaboration then, isn't it? Because their interpretation made you look at the poem in a different way
exactly.
well, which is fascinating.
Totally.
Yeah.
So then actually the poem isn't just written down, and it isn't just spoken, it is also then created in the space by the reaction from the people.
Yeah.
And I could have been like, oh no, it's funny, it shouldn't be funny, this is meant to be sad. But actually no, I was like, oh great, it's funny and sad. The guest poet, Noor, her name is a wonderful poet, I sat down next to her just after performing, and she turned to me and she said, that was beautiful.
Oh.
And that made my week. And that was just incredible. And I think that's my world of poetry currently. Me as an artist and a consumer of art, I love enjoying art and then talking with people about it, and then connecting around that. And if I can create art, share it with people, and then talk to people about my art and how it's impacted them in a way, that's so joyful. That's just incredible. Because then I'm like, oh, I actually created that thing that we're now connecting over.
And I think it really reinforces this sense that, in culture at the moment, and, maybe not so much in the UK, but certainly in places like the US, there's a kind of growing dismissal and suspicion around art, right? And it tends to be associated with the kind of liberal left that people are nervous of in certain groups. But actually, what you're talking about, and I think what lots of people have been talking about on this series, is this idea that actually art is what gives life, meaning might be a bit strong, but connection and ideas which energizes as well, right? You probably go away from those evenings feeling energized.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And enthused and all those lovely
100%,
things.
Yeah.
And obviously you can get that from sciences as well. I'm not saying you can't, but there is something about, I can hear how that can be really attractive, that kind of communal feeling.
Yeah.
It's more in the moment again,
yeah,
isn't it?
Definitely. Yeah, I think the word communal, I was just, as you were talking, I was just thinking about community. And the actual, so I spoke about Hinterland.
I'm going to have to come and see it.
You should. Yeah, there are two nights that I recommend. There's Hinterland Poetry Night, which is alcohol-free and vegan bar in Northern Quarter in Manchester. That's wonderful, and I've spoken at that a few times, and that's the one that Dominic Berry hosts mostly. So I've been to that a few times, but I think I've mostly read at one called Pull Up and Speak.
Oh yes, I've seen about that one.
Yeah, which is Pull Up is a Caribbean food bar.
Yes.
Really good food.
Yes.
But they have this event called Pull Up and Speak. But yeah, Sharon, who runs the night, she's an incredible community person. And that event, what I love about it, so many things I love about it, but you look around the room and you see people of all ages, people of all genders, in different backgrounds and races and religions, and they're all in this room together. Just this massive sort of cross section of society, which I don't think you get at every poetry night.
No.
And I think what you're saying about it's sort of considered maybe this sort of left sort of thing where just poets go to and all that. This isn't. It's anyone can go to this. And one Sharon is really keen on. Passionate about mental health, but also homelessness. One event I went to, a homeless man spoke on stage and shared his work, and that was incredible.
That must have been incredibly nerve-wracking for him.
Totally, and he said that. But Sharon was the person who spoke with him and said, "Look, you should read."
To do it, yeah.
He's like, "Should I?" He's like, "Yeah, you should," and it was incredible. And he has as much right to read as anyone else.
So it's like a democracy in action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I love Pull Up for. So I highly recommend that. But also, like, I noticed when I kept going to that event, it wasn't just about, you know, people doing their best and doing a wonderful performance, whatever. People were also sharing some really heavy stuff about their lives. And then that kind of inspired me. I've said poems on stage now that go into stuff that I haven't even told, like, some of my closest friends. But I've done it on stage in front of people, some of whom I know, some strangers. And that, for me, is a kind of therapeutic area of performance poetry and speaking on stage.
And is that because you're inhabiting a slightly different persona when you're on stage?
I don't think it is. I actually think when I'm on stage, I'm actually truly being my actual self. Even when I'm doing a performance, that is me.
Yeah.
There's a part of me that's a showman. But also there are poems that I've written that are truly deeply something internal about myself that's really going on, that I really need to express.
Yeah.
And the act of writing it down, that helps. That's therapeutic. But actually saying these things and then being heard and held, and knowing that other people in the room might relate. And that's enough. But then even afterwards, you chat about it, and people go, "Oh, I've been through that too," or "That really linked. That made me think about this thing, situation I've had." And then that's just so. I've come away from these nights being, "Oh wow, I feel much better now." And Sharon sometimes comes on stage and joins the poet and says to them, "Oh, how was that? How did that feel?" Like, so it's not just the poem, but just sort of expression about what it was like for them to actually share that stuff. So that's just really powerful and magical and wonderful. So
Good.
Yeah. So, Tara, how did you find poetry?
Well, I think my background is much more conventional. I think when I think back about it, I think I was always able, in a funny way, to at least be confident with the way that I read poetry. And one of the reasons that I became an academic was that because I wanted to kind of find a place where I could share that with people. That if you're somebody who happens to have that kind of skill, where you can unlock what language might be saying, then for me it was quite important to share that skill. And, I had a classic situation where I had really good English teachers and things like that. And I always just thought it was really amazing to turn the thing that you love most into your job. Obviously, that has its downsides because, yes, I do not read as much poetry as I would like to because I spend so much of my work time thinking about it, reading it, talking about it, particularly now with the podcast.
Yeah.
So I'm likely to go home and just read magazines or novels because it's just too much. In that world, you wouldn't go and do that for fun.
Totally understand that.
So in a way, it's a bit like killing your darlings, but you kind of manage it. But I think for the project, one of the things that's really spurred me on was I've basically been in this particular job now since 2012, and I work for the Department for Continuing Education, and we have lots of mature students and almost all part-time students. And my experience with those kinds of students has been that they're far more candid than other students, but they also can be more nervous and insecure about it. And, you and I mentioned imposter syndrome earlier when we were chatting, but a lot of students will have that.
Yeah.
And I sort of done this project almost with these students in mind, and I can give you some particular examples. So I had one student once who said that she couldn't read poetry because her husband told her that she couldn't.
Yeah, that's awful, isn't it?
Yeah, he said, well, you don't know enough about poetry to understand it, and everything you say is wrong. And she told me this like this was really fine and normal, and I thought, oh gosh, that stuff is still going on. Or we'll have people whose kids have finally flown the nest and gone to university, and they'll say to me, oh, well, my son says that I don't get it right because he's been taught in GCSE and A-level that it's this.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it is often a lot of women who are in this situation.
Yeah.
And also I think that, as we were talking with Will as well for his episode, that education in universities doesn't help, and it doesn't help at schools either. So there's a kind of culture whereby people think, I have to make what I'm doing important, and an easy way to do that is to make it difficult. And I've talked to you, before about the fact that sometimes I think I've been a bit dismissed by academics because I like to write and speak and think clearly. And I think it's really important to do that. And I think it's also really important to flatten the hierarchy as well, so that when I teach poetry, I'm sort of saying to people, every view is valid as long as it's not completely outrageous. I'll say, well, this poem obviously isn't about a UFO, but it might be about lots of things. And all those things are valid, right?
Yeah.
But lots of teachers will not teach like that.
Yeah.
And I've been told off for not teaching like that as well. I had an interview once, and I won't mention with who, and they said, I don't inspire enough fear in people, and I'm not hierarchical enough. But that's because that's central to the way that I teach, which is I want people to feel comfortable, and I want them to feel like they're my peers. Yeah. But that's, in a funny way, that can be slightly challenging for other academics who rely on that hierarchy. And so it's a very different approach. And I think the reason I wanted to do this project was that I encounter in so many situations, I have peers who don't like to teach poetry. I have friends who are frightened of poetry. I just know loads and loads of people that just wouldn't even pick up a book. They'd be too intimidated or nervous. And I remember even doing a workshop years ago at this beautiful house in the Cotswolds with a lot of Christian women. And for them, they were saying, is poetry transgressive? Does it go against my religion?
Right.
And again, our husbands aren't sure we should be doing this. And it's crazy. And you just think, or they will have had a really, bit like you, a really mean teacher who said, no, that's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's all it takes.
For sure.
Your idea is wrong. And I think as teachers we have to be really careful about the way that we use language, because for something for us that might just be a throwaway comment is something that people remember for decades.
Absolutely.
And they'll come up to you and they'll say, oh, you said this to me in my Oxford interview and I never forgot it. And you think, oh my goodness, I don't even remember that. But for them it's had this huge resonance. So I think, it's all about trying to reset those questions and those uncertainties around poetry and to try and get back to play and fun and confidence. Because it can teach you a lot, I think, poetry, if you let it.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that word play sort of cropping up again.
Well, I love playing with poetry when I teach it. It gives me so much joy. And I like communicating that joy. But it's so interesting though, because even though I'm not working class. I come from, what you would call a middle class family. But even then, I wouldn't say that there were loads of people in my childhood talking poetry or saying poetry. And even now, even with this podcast, there's a tiny bit of me who's a bit embarrassed, who's like, should I be talking about poetry so much and giving it so much time? Is it really useful? Does it have value? And I think I'm lucky in one respect because I'm half Irish, and Irish culture has a lot more understanding of celebration of poetry and recitation and performance. But then there's the other British side that wants to hide away and keep your head down and not put your head above the parapet. And then it feels sometimes a bit indulgent, a bit self-indulgent. But then anything can, I think. And I think we have to kind of let ourselves enjoy it. Yeah.
I think the work you're doing is wonderful, and it is inspiring change and changing things in motion, and there's a lot to change. I think so. I think one of the most interesting things I've done that wasn't in the podcast was I worked with a senior school, and all it was I got all the teachers to sit together and we looked at some of the poems they teach. And what was really interesting was that quite a lot of them admitted to being nervous of teaching those poems. And even though they do teach them, they don't like it because they don't have time to sit and actually engage with it. And there was one teacher in this workshop that I did who loved it. And she was communicating that to everyone, and then they were all really energised by her.
And then they wrote to me afterwards and said that they've changed the way they teach these works because of that workshop.
Oh, wow, brilliant.
And that they could see already that the students were responding better as well.
Yeah.
But all it was giving them time.
Mm.
It's not an indulgence to spend an hour and a half thinking about the poems you're teaching.
Sure.
It actually can have really useful change.
Yeah.
In the classroom and beyond, I guess. Because then the students are not being distracted like you in your physics class. They're like actually enjoying it.
Yeah.
Because the teacher's enjoying it.
Totally.
And just think about it it's so obvious, but I hadn't thought about it properly before, that if you're not inspired as a teacher, your students won't be inspired.
No, that's it. I mean, it's similar to like when you're performing. If you're not enjoying your performance, then your audience are not going to,
Yeah, and sometimes that can feel quite exhausting. I've had days when I haven't felt very well, and then I teach a lot in the evenings, and I'm going in and it's dark and it's cold, and I'm thinking, do I have to talk about poetry today?
Yeah.
But you just kind of do, because you think actually those students need the best of you, and they need to get that sense themselves that this is joyful.
Yeah.
And it's a privilege.
Mm.
We've used that word a little bit this week, but it is a privilege, I think.
It feels like, individual people, no matter their position or whatever, can make a difference in the way they do
effect,
their... Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
And sometimes it can feel a bit of a fool's errand, because you're just like, what's the end goal? But then every so often you get people who, a bit like you in your feedback, they write to you and say, actually, that's really helped. And one of the things I loved about the first series of this podcast was that lots of people I know had sent it to people they knew, and they wouldn't be people who had really encountered poetry before.
Yeah.
People who were like doctors or scientists or, lots of my family then passed it on to their friends. I mean, my extended family, it's really nice.
Yeah.
Because then some people were saying to me, I went out today and I bought the book that was recommended and I really enjoyed it, and I haven't bought a poetry book ever.
Yeah.
This is my first ever poetry book, and I'm 50 or something.
Yeah, like that's a huge impact, isn't it?
It's fantastic.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah. So I guess on that note, we were thinking we might tie up, didn't we, by talking about things that we love.
Yes.
Things that we would recommend.
Yes.
So what would you like to go for, Red?
Well, I would like to recommend a new book. It's called Leave the Trees, Please, which is, of course, if you're listening to this and you're into poetry, you might have heard of that. It's a poem by Benjamin Zephaniah, and it's
great Brummie poet.
Totally. And it's a book that's been illustrated by my friend Melissa, and she is an incredibly talented illustrator. And it's a wonderful book. I mean, I certainly heard the poem anyway. I knew I'd read it or heard it. But, I was with her recently because she's a very good friend of mine. She had this new book out. And I was like, I love this poem. Like, I know this one. And you illustrated this. Great, cool. And I looked through it and, and actually, I was going to buy it from her, but, I was at an event with her at an art fair and, selling her books. But that book was new and it sold out. And I was like, I want to buy this from you, and what's the best way? And she was like, you just buy it from a poetry, from a bookstore. And just this morning, I just happened to pop into a bookstore in Oxford, and there it was.
Serendipity.
Yeah. So I bought that, and I'd love to recommend that.
I mean, I had a look, and the illustrations are amazing.
Yeah. And
we were talking, weren't we, about how the illustrations are kind of reading of the poem, but also a story by themselves.
Yeah, so
it's really cool.
This is it. Yeah, so you've got the poem as it is, which obviously has its own meaning and wonderful, visualization. But you've also got these illustrations that tell a story.
Yeah.
That was actually written by the illustrator Melissa and Benjamin's wife. They sort of discussed it and figured out what the story should be.
And your friend did a beautiful portrait of Benjamin Zephaniah at the back as well. Because it was published posthumously in the
That's correct, yeah.
So it's a really beautiful tribute, I think.
So I recommend that. I spoke about them a little bit. If you live in Manchester or near Manchester or you're visiting Manchester, there's tons of poetry nights. You could go to any and they're wonderful. It's a huge scene for it. And if you're interested in just performance poetry and open mics in general, just find out what's going on near you and just go to it, because I find it just super wonderful. And not just as a poet, just as a human being.
It sounds like it's really a wonderful place to connect and share.
And how about you? What would you recommend?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this because obviously I read a lot of poetry, and because of that, and I write a lot about poetry, my interests change a lot. But I will say what my recent discoveries were, maybe. So somebody I discovered maybe 10, 15 years ago now was Michael Donaghy, who was a wonderful Irish-American poet who lived in the UK and worked at Birkbeck University and was tragically killed really young. And his poetry is amazing because it plays with form, which I love. And it's also deeply romantic and not very negative. It's actually some of his poems are quite riotous, and he also loves allusion, which I do. So he uses a lot of other poets like Keats and Yeats and people like that in his poetry. He has this lovely sonnet called The Present, which I wish I'd known about better when I got married, because it's one of the best sort of poems for a wedding I've ever seen.
Wow.
Which puns on the presentness of poetry. Poem as a gift, but love as a gift, being in the present, having presence, it's amazing. And I love those kind of punning poems. I also was going to say that, we haven't talked that much about poetry that helps us deal with things. And one of my most favourite collections of the last few years as well is Christopher Reid, R-E-I-D, Scattering, which is a sort of story in verse of his wife's cancer and her death and how he dealt with it. And it's absolutely beautiful and incredibly moving, but not miserable, because I think even the act of writing a poem is a kind of expression of hope. So it was like what Dominic was talking about the other day with his Rage poem. The fact that poem exists shows that there's something you can do with rage, right? Something positive and that has a almost material being that can counteract some of those feelings, right? And I think that Reid wrote this both as a kind of memoriam to his wife, but also to show how poetry can kind of live past us as well, and that actually it's a wonderful dedication to somebody that you've loved, right? So in that way, it's really positive. Also, I'll just mention Edwin Morgan, who we've mentioned before, who's a Scottish poet, and he writes brilliant sci-fi poems. Again, sci-fi is not my world.
Sure.
But he has these poems called Sonnets from Scotland that he wrote in the 80s, and it's about these Martians or aliens coming to Scotland, a kind of sort of dystopian Scotland. And the poem is written through their perspective.
Wow.
It's so fun.
Really cool.
It's really fun, and it's really playful.
Yeah, brilliant. Fantastic. Yeah. I think, listening to you there, I think there's a few things that kind of struck me, is that question of what is poetry. Which I think this podcast has gone some way into sort of providing answers for that. But also like that, you mentioned about poetry for wellness and kind of about helping you get through something, but also, so you might write something and that helps, and then you might put that in a book and then that helps, and then but then someone might read that and then that helps, but then also you might speak something on stage and that helps you, but then someone might hear that, or you might go to something, you might hear something and that helps you, or you might read it, or or you might experience it in a concrete poetry setting, and that might impact you. And I think just that idea of poetry is something that can be really beneficial for everyone. And
it reminds me of a poem that I'm always quoting, which is W.H. Auden's In Memory of W.B. Yeats, and he says poetry survives in the valley of its saying. So it goes, and he talks about mouths, it goes between mouths, and it kind of echoes and reverberates, and ends up far from where it started. And I think it is the momentariness of it that helps that, right? That you just described it so well, how it could go from person to person and ear to ear. And you pick up what you want to pick up from it, I think. So thank you so much, Red, and thank you for your hard work on the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for being a joy to work with, but also just introducing me to all of this sort of world of poetry and learning so much more. And I feel I've benefited a lot, and I really hope the listeners really benefit as well.
Yeah, and I feel like we've it's in the air we're breathing at the moment. So
yeah.
hopefully that comes to the listeners too. Well, thank you so much, and I'll see you next time on Demystifying Poetry. If you've enjoyed the podcast, do consider sharing it with your friends and your neighbours and anyone else you know. And also, you might consider sharing it on social media channels. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can comment on YouTube or Spotify.